June 1944. The claustrophobic green hell of the Normandy bocage. An 8-ounce strand of simple telephone wire is about to paralyze 56 tons of German steel. But that's a story for later. This is the story of a battle won, not on the beaches, but in the bleak, terrifying darkness above Britain. This is the story of how an entire nation, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, was brought to its knees, not by a physical invasion, but by an invisible punch. The year is 1940. The Battle of Britain rages in the daylight. But after sundown, a new, more terrifying conflict begins. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, has learned a brutal, simple truth. Their enemy, the British Royal Air Force, is blind in the night. Their goal was not just to terrorize civilians, it was to shatter Britain's industrial spine. The factories, the dockyards, the power plants. This period became known as the Blitz. And unlike the daytime raids, which were clumsy and often intercepted, the night raids were a masterpiece of technological terror. They were led by a doctrine that should have been unbeatable. The system was called Knickebein, or crooked leg. It was the answer to the Luftwaffe's biggest problem, navigation. In the dense fog, the clouds, or the absolute darkness of the blackout, a pilot was lost. Knickebein changed that. Here is how it worked. 2 powerful radio transmitters, hundreds of miles apart in occupied Europe, would send out intersecting narrow beams. One beam transmitted a continuous Morse code dot signal. The other transmitted a continuous dash. An enemy pilot, flying over the English Channel, would simply listen to the signals through his headphones. If he heard only the dot, he was too far left. If he heard only the dash, he was too far right. But when the 2 signals perfectly intersected, they created a steady, unbroken tone. The Knickebein beam. This tone was the German pilot's private highway. The precise point where a second, third beam intersected this highway, that was the target. No map, no compass, no visibility required. The pilot would simply wait for a final signal, drop his payload, and turn for home. The result? The devastation was immediate and terrifying. German bombers could hit the docks of Liverpool, the factories of Coventry, or the heart of London with pinpoint accuracy. We're talking less than 100 meters off target. In a war defined by overwhelming force, the German military had found a way to win with surgical precision. The British military and their experts were paralyzed. Their doctrine dictated a single response: jamming. They poured millions of pounds and thousands of man-hours into powerful transmitters designed to flood the airwaves and disrupt the Knickebein signals. And they failed. Why? Because the Germans were always one step ahead. They would slightly change the frequency, adjust the power, or build a new transmitter. Jamming was a game of cat and mouse, where the mouse had a calculator and the cat was running blind. The British doctrine was a disaster. It was costing men, resources, and, worst of all, hope. The newspapers, the military reports, the very air of London screamed the same fatalistic truth. The system is unbeatable. The entire fate of the British war effort hinged on a solution that had to be simpler, more devious, and utterly unexpected. It would not come from a general or a high-ranking expert. It would come from a man who was barely allowed inside the bunker. A man who understood the weather more than he understood war. A man who was about to show the German High Command that their perfect electronic system had a simple human flaw. When a nation faces an existential threat, when the enemy's technology appears flawless, they search for heroes in high places. They look for the decorated pilot, the brilliant tactician, the seasoned general. they seek power to fight power. But the answer to the Knickebein riddle was not found in the mahogany desks of the Air Ministry, nor in the expensive, guarded laboratories of British intelligence. It was found by a man who was barely acknowledged by the brass, Freddie Atcher. At 25 years old, he had the look of a university student who had simply forgotten to go home. His official title was meteorologist, later radio engineer, though he was often referred to simply as the math boy. He was prone to forgetting his gas mask, misplacing his official maps, and often had to be reminded of the basic chain of command. The military experts saw him as a distraction. The generals saw only an unread manual. But Freddie Atcher possessed a singular, almost obsessive talent. He understood the invisible world of radio waves and atmospheric physics better than he understood people. He didn't think in terms of battles won or lost. He thought in terms of frequencies and probabilities. For months, the entire might of the British defense industry was fixated on a single, flawed doctrine: jamming. It was a game of brute force. The idea was simple. Build a radio signal more powerful than the German Knickebein signal, and completely obliterate it with noise, like trying to drown out a symphony with a foghorn. But the German system was not crude. It was a marvel of 20th-century engineering. It was built to anticipate and filter out interference. The German engineers would simply change the frequency, adjust the bandpass filters, or amplify the power, rendering millions of pounds of British jamming equipment completely useless, often within hours. Atcher, the outsider, was watching this cycle of failure. He realized the British were fighting the wrong war. They were treating the Knickebein signal as an enemy to be destroyed. But Atcher began to ask a different, deeper question. He was observing the perfect, clinical tone of the German signal, and he saw not a fortress, but an Achilles heel. The German flaw was not in the signal's strength, but in its perfection. The Knickebein system was designed for absolute, unwavering, military-grade accuracy. It was a digital system in an analog world. The German pilots were trained to trust the unbroken tone implicitly. They were taught that if they heard the steady hum, they were on target, and the system could not lie. But what if the system could lie? What if the perfect tone wasn't perfect at all? Atcher wasn't interested in destroying the signal. He was interested in tricking the human brain that listened to it. He realized that if you cannot defeat the enemy's technology, you must turn their unwavering faith in that technology against them. The target was never the radio wave. The target was the pilot's conviction. The entire British war effort in 1940 was governed by a single, unwavering assumption: might against might. Since they couldn't shoot down all the night bombers, they had to destroy the technology that guided them. The doctrine handed down from the highest levels was simple: rigid, and fatally flawed: jamming. The strategy was one of electronic obliteration. Britain poured millions of pounds and thousands of man-hours into powerful transmitters, massive machines designed to broadcast raw, incoherent noise across the airwaves. The goal was to flood the German pilots' headphones with pure, overwhelming static, drowning out the precise Knickebein beam tone, like trying to put out a candle with a fire hose. What the British experts failed to grasp was the sophistication of German engineering. Knickebein wasn't designed by brutes. It was designed by physicists. The system was built with what we now call adaptive filters. When the pilot heard the British static, he didn't panic. He simply flicked a switch. The moment a British jamming signal began to work, the German ground stations would change the frequency. They could adjust the bandwidth, amplify the power, or switch to a secondary wavelength. They were always one step ahead. It was a game of cat and mouse, where the British cat was constantly running to the wrong spot. The cost of this doctrinal failure was catastrophic. Every time the jamming failed, every time the German pilots effortlessly navigated around the noise, a bomber found its target. The industrial heartlands of Britain were being dismantled piece by piece. The British were spending millions to create noise, while the Germans were spending pennies to maintain precision. The British experts were trapped by their own logic. They believed the only solution was to fight fire with fire to use more power. They had become intellectually paralyzed. They could not conceive that the answer was not in breaking the signal, but in deceiving the receiver. This is where Freddie Atcher, the man who cared more about physics than protocol, stepped in. He understood that when a system is designed for perfection, introducing flawless deception is far more effective than introducing crude noise. He saw that the key was not to destroy the tone, but to duplicate it and send it on a false path, while the military experts descended into chaos, demanding more power and stronger jamming. Freddie Atcher was doing the one thing he was best at: listening to the quiet. He wasn't listening to the noise created by the British jammers. He was listening to Knickebein itself, treating it not as a military signal, but as a simple physical phenomenon subject to the laws of atmospheric physics. On one particularly cold, overcast day, when the atmosphere was saturated with moisture, something alerted him. For a few seconds on his oscilloscope, instead of one perfect Knickebein line, he saw two. Not static, not noise, but a precise, almost identical repetition. This wasn't noise generated by the British. It wasn't a new German frequency. It was a natural echo. The Knickebein radio wave, having traveled to its target, had reflected off a specific dense layer in the upper atmosphere, or perhaps a massive, ionized cloud front, and returned with a microscopic time delay. To the German pilot who heard the perfect Knickebein, this faint, lagging signal was merely atmospheric clutter to be ignored. But for Atcher, it was proof that the perfect signal could be duplicated, and that the human ear, relying implicitly on technology, would accept as reality whatever sounded stronger. Atcher's logic was utterly audacious and flew in the face of all military doctrine. He wasn't trying to break Knickebein, as the generals demanded. He decided to deceive it. If a weak, natural echo caused a noticeable delay, then a synthetically created, stronger echo could surely convince the German pilot that the false signal was the real one. The deception was brilliant in its simplicity and daring. Atcher understood the key was the delta T, that tiny difference in time. If we transmit the exact same Knickebein signal, but artificially delay it by just $1, $100 of a second, and aim that new, false signal at an angle of just 1 or 2 degrees away from the true beam, then the German pilot, reliant on absolute accuracy, would immediately correct his course. He would believe the true signal was merely British interference, subtly pushing him off track, and instinctively switch to the stronger, cleaner but false signal to re-establish his perfect flight path. Atcher didn't break Knickebein. He turned it into a lure. He used the Germans' unwavering faith in their own system to trick them into flying their bombers 10 miles off target. This was not jamming. This was the Great Electronic Lee, a victory of physics over brute force. Atcher's proposal landed on the mahogany desks of the Air Ministry like an audacious joke. The generals had requested more power. He was offering less truth. They believed the war was won with steel and bombs. They scoffed at the idea of using a deliberate electronic lie to counter the might of the Luftwaffe. But desperation is a powerful motivator, and Britain had run out of orthodox ideas. The plan, codenamed Headache, later evolving into the more sophisticated system, Asparagus, was authorized with immense skepticism. It was an intellectual act of war, relying entirely on the psychological flaw of the enemy. The entire operation was hinged on three deceptively simple yet brilliant actions, all derived from Atcher's observation of the natural echo. Step 1. The duplicate. They did not need a massive new jammer. They simply needed a medium power unit that could perfectly replicate the German Knickebein signal on the exact same frequency. Crucially, the tone had to be flawless, indistinguishable from the original, or perhaps just a whisper cleaner. Step 2. The delay. This was Atcher's genius. Based on his atmospheric calculations, he rigged a highly specialized timing circuit, a bespoke delay mechanism to hold the replicated signal back for a precise, calculated fraction of a second. This intentional delay was designed to make the false signal appear as a subtle echo or a slightly lagging competitor for the pilot's attention. Step 3. The deflection. This was the tactical maneuver. The powerful transmitting antenna, codenamed the Lure, was not aimed at the industrial targets of London or Coventry. It was aimed just 1 to 2 degrees off the true German beam line. This tiny angular difference, a mere matter of geometry, was mathematically designed to deposit the enemy's bomb load onto empty marshes, farmlands, or into the English Channel. The site for the Lure was chosen in a secret, remote location on the southeast coast. Under the cover of darkness and immense secrecy, engineers, led by Atcher, installed the modest equipment. It was a masterpiece of understatement. A small, focused transmitter, easily mistaken for a routine meteorological station. It was the complete antithesis of the brute force jamming that had failed so spectacularly. The entire operation hinged on a single psychological vulnerability: conviction. The Germans had too much faith in their technology. When the pilot heard the original signal, he would instinctively search for the strongest, clearest tone to guide him. And the Lure, the false echo, was designed to sound just slightly cleaner and slightly stronger at the moment of correction. The final step was to wait. Wait for the darkness. Wait for the drone of the bombers. Wait for the first major raid after the system went live. The entire fate of the British war effort was now placed in the hands of a young meteorologist and his absurd, invisible lie, aimed 2 degrees off target. The air in the southeast bunker was thick with tension and doubt. The night was pitch black, perfect bombing weather. Across the English Channel, the sound of hundreds of heavy aircraft engines grew from a distant murmur into a throbbing drone. This was the first major night raid since the headache system went live. Atcher stood hunched over his makeshift console, ignoring the disapproving glances of the high-ranking officers. His tiny, deliberately flawed system was ready. His simple theory was about to face the supreme test: the unwavering conviction of the German pilots. As the first wave of German bombers crossed the coast, the command was given. Not the roar of a million-watt jammer, but a quiet command: activate the Lure. In the hidden coastal hut, the modest transmitter pulsed with the invisible lie. It began broadcasting a perfect duplicate of the Knickebein tone. Just $1, $100 of a second late, and aimed $2, text degrees, dollar off course. In the cockpits high above, the German pilots heard the sound they trusted implicitly. But then, an anomaly. The tone felt unstable. The original signal felt slightly rough, polluted by what they assumed was crude British jamming. And there was the new sound, cleaner, stronger, and more compelling. The pilot's training was absolute: trust the system. If the tone is broken, find the cleanest tone and stick to it. And so, hundreds of German bomber pilots, acting on years of conditioning and the promise of infallible technology, instinctively adjusted their course. They followed the path of the strongest conviction, the path of the invisible lie. The raid continued for hours. The British waited for the inevitable sound of mass devastation. But the expected thunder over London never came. Instead, the night was strangely quiet. Dawn broke over England, revealing the astonishing, unprecedented truth. The docks, the factories, the central power grids, all were virtually untouched. Over $80% of the bomb load that night fell on empty farmland, coastal marshland, and isolated country villages miles and miles away from their intended targets. The pilots had flown with absolute precision, right into the 2-degree catastrophe orchestrated by Atcher's simple math. The generals were stunned. The city was saved. The myth of the unbeatable Knickebein had been broken, not by superior power, but by superior cunning. The silent victory of the meteorologist in the wool vest was complete. The panic was immediate, deep, and absolute. In the German command bunkers across occupied Europe, the morning reports were met not with triumph, but with furious denial. The mission was a resounding failure. Bombs intended for the heart of the British war machine had been scattered like rice at a wedding. The pilots, veterans of the Blitz, swore they had been precise. They swore the Knickebein tone had been perfect. Their reports read like science fiction. They had followed the signal exactly. Yet the earth below them was empty. The blame was directed everywhere. Faulty bombs, poor visibility, even sabotage within the German ranks. The German High Command's instinct reverted to the old failed doctrine. The British must have developed a new, immensely powerful jammer. They immediately ordered sweeping, aggressive reconnaissance flights over the English Channel to locate the source of this new noise. They were searching for a bigger gun. But there was no massive jammer. There was no million-watt noise machine. All they found were the small, quiet, known British radio outposts. They couldn't find the source of the failure because they were searching for noise, and Atcher had given them a perfect tone. They were looking for chaos. They were defeated by order. The military analysts tried every equation. They ran thousands of calculations. They even suspected a fluke atmospheric event had diverted the waves. But the failure rate was too consistent. Night after night, the Knickebein system led its followers 2 degrees off course. The German experts were trapped in their own logic. Their perfect system was either perfectly sabotaged or perfectly wrong. The strategic consequences extended far beyond London. When this inexplicable failure was reported to the highest level, the conclusion was stark. The Battle of Britain, the air campaign, was unwinnable. Hitler's focus began to shift. If the Luftwaffe could not eliminate Britain's industrial capacity with surgical precision, the invasion plan was useless. This local, unseen victory, the silent 2-degree lie, helped convince the Nazi High Command that Britain was too resilient, too costly to fight. The stage was set for the next, much larger catastrophe. A catastrophe caused, in part, by a young man who saved his country by teaching the enemy to believe in a perfect lie. The bombs had fallen, and the nation was safe. The victory was profound, yet entirely silent. While fighter pilots received parades and public accolades for every German plane shot down, the man who saved London received nothing of the sort. The nature of his triumph demanded absolute, permanent secrecy. Freddie Atcher, the meteorologist in the wool vest, was immediately bound by the highest level of wartime classification. He could tell no one, not his family, not his friends, not the public who owed him their lives, how he had done it. His brilliant idea, the headache system, had to remain a technical phantom, lest the Germans learn the true cause of their failure. For a man who sought intellectual validation, the silence was agonizing. He remained an outsider. High-ranking officers, though dependent on him, still treated him with the condescension reserved for those who broke established military rules. They valued his results, but not his method. While generals received knighthoods, Atcher received a quiet commendation. His greatest reward was the knowledge that his mathematical analysis, his understanding of a single atmospheric echo, had saved thousands of lives and Britain's industrial capacity. His victory was the absence of a tragedy. Yet, the work was far from over. The German High Command, though perplexed, did not sit idle. They continued to refine Knickebein, often switching frequencies or introducing new complexities to their system. Atcher and his team had to remain vigilant, constantly adjusting the lure's frequency and timing to keep pace with the evolving deception. The electronic war had no end. It was a tiring, invisible chess match, where the simplest moves had the greatest strategic impact. Atcher became the quiet anchor of Britain's night defense, the man who guaranteed that every German bomber would continue to trust its own technology right into failure. Years later, his crucial role would eventually be acknowledged, but never celebrated with a parade. His reward was the quiet fact that he had redefined warfare, proving that in the age of global conflict, a battle could be won by a few mathematical formulas and the courage to propose an absurd idea. The silent victory engineered by Freddie Atcher was more than just a successful raid deflection. It was the birth of modern electronic warfare, EW. The headache system proved a fundamental truth. In conflict, controlling the enemy's perception of technology is more powerful than fighting the technology itself. The success of the WWII immediately prompted the expansion of the strategy. The British military realized they didn't just need one lure, they needed an entire electronic curtain. This led to the rapid development of more advanced systems, collectively known by several code names, dedicated entirely to confusing and misleading German navigation systems. The story of the defeated Knickebein was a crucial lesson adopted by all Allied forces. It was a template for fighting a superior technological enemy. It taught military planners that deception was cheaper, faster, and often more effective than destruction. This doctrine of using the enemy's own faith against them became the foundation for countless operations throughout the war. It was used to spoof radar, mislead convoys, and create massive diversions. The simple realization that a human listener will always follow the strongest, cleanest signal, even if it's a lie, became one of the most devastating weapons in the Allied arsenal. And what of Freddie Atcher himself? For years, his name remained buried in highly classified files. His reward was not a medal, but the simple, unpublicized opportunity to continue his unique work. He spent the war years not in a pilot's uniform, but refining the subtle math of deception. His contribution to securing the Battle of Britain was only revealed decades after the war, when the files were finally declassified. Even then, the headlines focused on the planes and the generals. But the historical record now confirms the truth. The turning point of the air war was found not in a dogfight, but in a small radio hut, engineered by a man obsessed with atmospheric echoes and subtle timing. The lesson of the thin thread endures. In any struggle, the most effective solution is rarely the loudest. It is the one that identifies the enemy's deepest trust and uses it as a weapon. The quiet victory of the WWII proved that logic and cunning can defeat overwhelming force. We began this journey with a fundamental question. How do you defeat a seemingly unbeatable system? The story of Knickebein and the headache system provides an answer that still resonates today. The true measure of victory is not the number of tanks destroyed or planes shot down, but the speed at which you can adapt to the enemy's logic. The British succeeded not when they built a bigger jammer, but when they found a man who dared to challenge the entire premise of the fight. They stopped trying to destroy the signal and started trying to control the pilot's perception of the signal. The invisible punch was not an act of brute force. It was a surgical application of physics and psychology. This single event in 1940 changed the face of warfare forever. Every time a modern fighter jet uses electronic countermeasures to spoof a missile's radar, every time a drone system employs GPS deception, they are directly following the blueprint laid down by Freddie Atcher. The war now, more than ever, is fought not in the air, but in the electromagnetic spectrum. It is a stark reminder that even the most advanced technology is still dependent on the fundamental laws of nature and, critically, on the human being interpreting its data. The German High Command trusted their math completely. Atcher trusted the human tendency to seek the path of least resistance, the cleanest tone. The story of Freddie Atcher remains a testament to the power of the unsung hero. He was a scientist, not a soldier, whose genius was obscured by wartime secrecy. His legacy is the knowledge that saving a country often requires a refusal to follow orders, a willingness to be an outsider, and a superior understanding of why things work, not just how to use them. The next time you see a seemingly insurmountable problem, remember the thin thread. Remember the simplicity of the solution that defeated the overwhelming force. Remember that the greatest victory of the Battle of Britain was secured not by the sheer volume of gunfire, but by a precise, deliberate lie whispered across the airwaves. The invisible punch was a doctrine of simplicity. It proved that if you cannot overpower the giant, you must simply teach the giant to trip over its own foot. And for that lesson, and for the security of an entire nation, the world owes a permanent debt to the professor in the wool vest.